working to keep state and church separate, just like our founding fathers intended. Please support the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
Hi, I'm Mandisa Thomas, founder and president of Black Nonbelievers Incorporated. I hope you are enjoying this year's annual Secular Student Alliance Conference. We are a proud partner with this organization, and our work in amplifying the voices for and providing community for Black atheists and religion doubters does include secular students. I'd like to ask you today to consider a tax-deductible donation to support our work. You may visit our website at blacknonbelievers.org to find out more information and to stay up to date on our events. Thank you very much. Please stay safe and continue to enjoy the presentations.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's good to see you again. This is the final session of the 2020 SSA virtual conference. We're really excited to close out the conference really strong with an exciting and informative talk from Kavin Senapathy. Kavin is a writer, a journalist, a speaker, covering science, health, food, and parenting at outlets like Self Magazine, Slate, The Daily Beast, Forbes, SciShow, Undark Magazine, and more. She's also co-founder and contributing editor at SciMoms.com. She's based in Madison, Wisconsin, where she's currently quarantine co-parenting a third grader and a first grader. That sounds like a lot. A puggle and an Italian gray Wawa. You can follow her at K Senapathy on Twitter, and she's going to have more information about how to follow her in her presentation as well. Kavin, welcome. It's really great to have you with us. We've had a great conference so far, and I can't think of a better way to wrap things up here than to talk about such a relevant topic as we look at the COVID-19 pandemic and a lot of science denial that was present in our culture before the pandemic hit, and now just this piling on top. So really look forward to what you have to share with us today.
Awesome. So, okay, I think I screen now, right?
Excellent.
Okay. Thank you, Ryan. Okay, my screen. All right, so I think we are all set then. You might hear my dogs barking, so hopefully that will stay at a minimum, but I'm sorry, Luna, you see her in the picture back there, as well as Sebastian. They're not too happy with me right now because they are locked downstairs. But it is awesome to be a part of this amazing lineup. I've been looking forward to this talk ever since I was supposed to present it at an actual face-to-face conference that people fly to, you know, like how we did in the before times. But even though the circumstances aren't ideal, I am glad to have this opportunity to address all of you secular students and everyone else here today, tuning in from all over the place. So I'm here with you to talk about something that matters to all of us, as Ryan mentioned. The talk is about vaccines, which are among the greatest medical success stories in modern civilization, and something that we're all desperately waiting for when it comes to this pandemic. All right. The talk is also about science communication, or CYCOM, which is a fairly new term that's been around since the late 80s and early 90s. It's basically any communication about science to the so-called public from various entities. They include media, governments, academia, scientists, industry, and more. Now, what does and doesn't constitute CYCOM is a matter of contention in the broader science and communication spheres. But nevertheless, CYCOM is often bandied about as the antidote to misinformation about science. I sometimes do CYCOM, although that's just a part of the writing and the journalism that I do. And I got into what I do in 2011 after I had my first child. That is Luna. I'm really gonna have to make it up to her. But anyway, in 2011, I was a new mom who was terrified of everything potentially hurting my baby. So I figured out how to pull out the credible nuggets from all of the junk, which was a game changer really as far as life skills go. And shortly thereafter, I started doing it professionally. And soon I found myself knee deep in the world of CYCOM and quickly became sort of a devotee. I saw fear about the well-being of our kids and our families and our fellow human and non-human animals and our environment as being like a cage. And the profiteers driving this fear exploit a lack of scientific understanding to spread misinformation. So scientific facts, I thought, are the key to unlocking these cages. And so I set out to do my part to help others escape their fears. One sec, I think I am just checking a chat to make sure that you can hear me. Okay, there are people tuning.
Good. We're doing good.
Awesome. So as I was saying, scientific thoughts are like a key to unlocking these cages. So as my body of work grew, my reporting involved a raft of scientific, industry, and medical experts, and a slew of people living the lives that intersect with my beats, which are broadly science, parenting, health, and food, as Ryan mentioned. And I've run in a number of fascinating circles, including pharma and medicine, women's health, scientific skepticism, and more. And so for a while, I saw myself as a science-wielding information slayer, sort of joining forces with others who strive to address bad information wherever it strikes. But time and again, I encountered this common unsettling thread that runs through it all. And that's that the forces that seek to correct widespread misinformation about science, like misinformation about vaccines, have been effectively cutting off the heads of what I call the Misinformation Hydra. I've been saying that for a few years, but it's only been recently, the last couple of years, that I've understood its anatomy. Now, what this talk isn't is a debunking of common vaccine hesitancy misinformation or a refutation of specific pseudo documentaries that purport to reveal the so-called truth about vaccines, but do nothing but, or an explanation of how vaccines work. I could certainly do a lovely wonders of science type of talk on how different vaccines work. And I've recently done a bunch of writing about how different viruses infect us and like how all of their little parts interact with our cells, various little parts. But that's not happening today, although I'll provide you with some resources if you're interested in that. And it also won't be a catalog of the most wacky anti-vaccine views, although we'll feature some of them. The talk will explore why vaccine hesitation is so pervasive, despite the plethora of science-clad facts to support recommended vaccines. It'll also shed light on the science communication landscape when it comes to vaccines. And it'll examine why so many CYCOM professionals compare their jobs to a game of whack-a-mole. And as secular students, I'm hoping that the themes here will stick with you as you examine the issues, both as scholars and as global citizens. The bottom line is that you can't solve a problem unless you define it broadly. So the problem is the spread of misinformation about important things that involve science. And that's not only vaccines. There are a slew of others like biotechnology, climate change, alternative health trends, and fads like homeopathy and essential oils, and like the purported benefits of steaming your vagina, and so much more. So the question is whether science communication can be the solution to the spread of misinformation about science. The answer lies in my very nerdy analogy of the Hydra, which I will get into shortly. Now, in the interest of lighthearted self-deprecation, I'll share with you all my background as a glorified mommy blogger. And I think mommy bloggers have their place answering the tough questions. I've cultivated a vantage point that has helped me visualize the CYCOM arena from a sort of aerial view, including where CYCOM encounters the issue of vaccines. So you'll see here my trading card from scimoms.com, a website that I co-founded and that focuses on evidence-based living in general, as well as parenting. And we also have a very awesome comic series with our Lego characters. So please head over to Twitter and follow us at SciMoms. So the purpose of today is to paint a picture of the vaccine communication landscape based on my experiences and observations as a journalist and a science writer, and a Midwestern mom of two, as well as a kid of immigrants, which I am. And I'm also a fan of just knowing the truth about important stuff. So of course, there will also be evidence. There is a science to science communication, and the literature and data are fascinating when it comes to vaccine and other things. By the end of this talk, you'll understand what I mean by Misinformation Hydra. And as energetic, passionate secular students, many of whom are science-minded, you'll have a broader picture of what CYCOM is up against. After all, you have to sort of know what you're up against to have a fighting chance. And you all really are the hope for our future. Like, seriously, you're the hope for our future. Millennials like me are counting on you. So for the purposes of this talk, we'll assume that all recommended vaccines are hugely beneficial to individuals and society and pose a vanishingly low risk to the vast majority of people. Vaccines save millions of lives per year, and more than 1 million people die from vaccine-preventable illness each year. And this isn't mostly because of anti-vaxxers. A lot of it has to do with access to healthcare and a lot of other factors. And these are, and I cannot stress enough, the ironclad facts when it comes to vaccines. And I promise Luna also loves vaccines. She is also vaccinated, but she is not pleased with me right now. I promise, Luna, I'll make it up to you. But vaccines are generally pretty freaking awesome, but too many people still don't like them. Studies show vaccine opposition remains strong, and researchers are warning that vaccine denial could undermine efforts to end the coronavirus pandemic. And we know it started before COVID. In 2019, the World Health Organization included vaccine hesitancy in its list of the top 10 threats to global health. You probably remember the recent measles outbreaks that happened due to a drop in vaccination rate. And that's because of herd immunity. It happens, as many of you know, when a large enough percentage of a community has immunity to a given infectious disease, and the whole community is protected when this happens with enough people. And that herd immunity is waning against diseases that we've successfully fought back, to me, is terrifying. And it also raises the question that tons of researchers have been asking, namely, like, why do people forego vaccines? Like, why? It's the question on the top of many minds. So the late 90s gave birth to the contemporary so-called anti-vaccine movement. And I put that in quotes because it's tricky. Many people who have doubts about vaccines wouldn't call themselves anti-vaccine. And some of that makes sense. But anyway, the late 90s, for one, that's when the now disgraced former gastroenterologist Andrew Wakefield published a fraudulent paper linking immunizations with autism. And again, I can't stress this enough, vaccines have never caused autism. I don't have time right now to get into all of the science that shows that beyond a doubt. And also all of the ableism inherent in that notion, although I'll touch on that later. But also, of course, the 90s is when the World Wide Web became widely accessible. I remember it well. I was in middle school. But that gave us all the gift of information at our fingertips. And it also gave us the curse of misinformation at our fingertips. So in addition to Wakefield, a cast of characters that occupies the current vaccine denial landscape emerged. Epidemiologist and science communicator, Dr. Tara C. Smith, she's a professor at Kent State University College of Public Health, described this cast of characters in a 2017 article. The characters include doctors who don't go by the body of evidence, includes celebrities, organizers and activists, as well as mommy bloggers, and of course, opportunists and profiteers. And here are some of that cast of characters, as well as some of the most common themes in the contemporary vaccine denial movement. And while the specifics of vaccine denial details vary, studies suggest that they hold true around the world. These themes include that vaccines contain dangerous toxins and chemicals like mercury and human aborted fetal tissue that can lead to autism and various chronic health conditions. It includes that vaccines shed from people who get them and enter the bodies of others, causing harm. You've probably all heard the idea that vaccines are a tool of big pharma profit motives. Of course, the natural is better idea. Too many vaccines are given too soon to our infants, and that we can't trust our government and medical institutions to protect us. And finally, the loss of bodily autonomy. Now, on the right, you'll see some of the cast of characters doing what they do. I've had run-ins with a few of these people, and because I'm going to be empathetic to some of these themes, I want to make clear how very dangerous and unethical this cast of characters has been. For instance, on the upper left there, you see Dr. Joe Mercola encouraging people to listen to his podcast and take control of your health, which is not what he is helping listeners do at all. It's more like take control of your wallet. I've covered Mercola. He took advantage of the internet starting in the 90s, and he positioned himself as a more trustworthy alternative to mainstream medicine. He founded Mercola.com, which is a natural health blog and e-commerce empire. And he was one of the early adopters of the now common shtick from the larger cast of characters, basically that he's protecting people from big pharma and toxic chemicals and uncaring, profiteering doctors. In 2017, I was quoted in a piece about Dr. Mercola in The Ringer, in which I say that Joseph Mercola is among the top misinformation vectors of our time when it comes to health, medicine, food, parenting, and more. He promotes fear of chemicals and spreads anti-GMO and anti-vaccine sentiment, all while peddling alternatives to line his pockets. And he is still doing that to this day. Now, you've probably seen Mercola. He's all over the place, including appearances on the Dr. Oz show. And if you look over at the image on the lower right-hand side, you'll see Dr. Oz himself fear-mongering about one of the most common themes, which is that there are dangerous and scary chemicals in vaccines, in this case, thimerosal. Now, calling thimerosal mercury is a common sleight of hand that these hucksters pull, right? Mercury is a naturally occurring element found in the Earth's crust, air, soil, and water. And methyl mercury and ethyl mercury are very different. Thimerosal contains ethyl mercury, which prevents the growth of harmful pathogens in multi-dose vials. Methyl mercury is the type of mercury found in certain kinds of fish, and at high exposure levels, methyl mercury, not ethyl mercury, can be toxic to people. But the idea that we're injecting kids with mercury is definitely unsettling, and you can't blame people for falling for this kind of charlatanry. Now, since the 90s, CYCOM has turned its sights to the contemporary anti-vaccine movement. The CYCOM comes again from governments and medical institutions, academia, industry, scientists, researchers, and tenacious volunteers who totally deserve props. You know who you are. There are a few examples here of that CYCOM, including an absolutely shameless promo of a SciMom's infographic on the HPV vaccine. Well done and accurate, accessible, science-based information about vaccines is absolutely a crucial public health service. And Andrew Wakefield and the ilk that he sort of gave birth to seem like an entirely contemporary phenomenon, especially because of the internet. So it might be surprising to learn that anti-vaccine sentiment is nothing new. Here you see a few examples of ye olde anti-vaccine artifacts. Like the sermon pamphlet is from the 18th century. And then there's a lot going on the third one from the left, vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. It depicts a police officer holding back this mother as her infant is forcibly vaccinated. And it also suggests that there's a big pharma conspiracy to oppose sanitation measures. The reasoning behind this conspiracy theory still stands strong today. Basically that it was sanitation alone that eliminated vaccine preventable disease and not vaccination. Needless to say, this is not true, but as a parent, I can definitely see why these views are compelling enough to withstand the centuries. Now, you're probably aware that the vast majority of US states have religious or philosophical exemptions from school immunization requirements. Some in the vaccine advocacy camp argue that we should get rid of these exemptions, while others argue that this could fuel anti-vaccine sentiment, removes bodily autonomy, and may harm the most marginalized people. And on the whole, it's not clear whether eliminating these exemptions would make an impact on vaccination rates. That seems, according to the evidence, in the air in some ways. I'm personally on the fence about whether these exemptions should be eliminated, but one thing is clear, and that is that eliminating exemptions and making vaccination mandatory probably is not going to happen in America anytime soon. So if states don't eliminate philosophical exemptions, then what's left is to explain that anti-vaccine propaganda isn't true, share the facts, educate about the science, and convince more people to vaccinate of their own accord. Well, yes, but, and that's a big but, as Dr. Tara Smith wrote in that same article, that one impulse many scientists may have is to simply educate the public. This is known as the information deficit model of science communication. And it assumes that the public is merely uneducated or undereducated about vaccines, and that providing additional factual information will fill this knowledge gap and lead people toward vaccinating. But unfortunately, information alone has not been shown to increase vaccine confidence among hesitant parents. It's no surprise that lots of folks in CYCOM compare their jobs to a game of whack-a-mole. And for some reason, when I found this photo of a game of whack-a-mole, I really wanted to go to an arcade and play it. So someday we will all go to arcades again, right? But I asked this question on Twitter recently for the purposes of today's talk, but also for the larger purpose of a project that I'm working on about science communication, about all of the issues that I cover, including vaccines, but also alternative medicine and GMOs and so on. And a bunch of folks did respond to the tweet. Several said that they regularly describe it as being like whack-a-mole, while others had similar analogies. One compared it to the 1980s arcade game Galaga. Shout out Tim Caulfield. And another suggested it's like putting out fires. Sometimes getting Luna to calm down is also like putting out fires, but that's okay. We love her. She's an old lady. Anyhow, one scientist who does CYCOM messaged me privately to share that he thinks of the story of Raktabija, who is a demon in Hindu folklore. The story goes that whenever his blood spilled, new demons would appear wherever the blood landed. But what ties these all together is the imagery of a foe that won't die. So for the past few years, I've visualized it as cutting the heads off of what I call the Misinformation Hydra, a version of the mythical beast with many heads, and the heads grow back when you slay them. This is a model that allows us to visualize that the misinformation problem is not only never ending, but also that it's systemic. So I'll take you through a basic diagram of what I'm talking about. So here's the Misinformation Hydra as it pertains to vaccines. And its heads are the misinformation that keep popping back up, as well as the cast of characters that spew it. Conspiracy theories are a part of it. And sorry, Bill Gates, he's become like an anti-vaccine whipping boy in a lot of ways. But the heads are also misinformation about chemicals, the rise in chronic illnesses, autism, and so on. And I have been and often am this brave soul with the sword. They represent CYCOM, and the sword itself is all of the evidence, scientific explanations, and refutations of misinformation. And as you can see, the misinformation slayers are extremely exhausted. By the way, shout out to Lorraine Scuda, who made this art for me recently, the Hydra and the doomed soul trying to slay it. But the reason that the CYCOM is so exhausted is because it's impossible for science communicators armed with a misinformation slaying sword of evidence to vanquish the Hydra. Many CYCOM folks do a few additional things that do help make headway. One of them, in green there, is what I call arming people with a misinformation radar. So not only does some vaccine communication refute misinformation, it also teaches people to spot and identify misinformation before they fall for it, sort of an inoculation effect. Not long back, as I documented in a chapter that I wrote for the 2017 book called Pseudoscience, The Conspiracy Against Science, the chapter was actually called The Inoculation Effect. I thought that this alone was the primary missing part that made the Hydra so immortal, that enough of those that CYCOM folks call, quote, the public, just don't know how to identify misinformation about science when they see it. That was a few years ago, but since then, I've seen that there's more to it than that. And I call them the Hydra's lifeblood and its organs and tissues and its underbelly. And the metaphor is interesting, but there's just so much meat to that metaphor that I won't be able to get to today, but there is. I'll get to some of it. Basically, science communication is not equipped to slay this beast on its own. Too many people in CYCOM don't know this, which I think puts them at a disadvantage. And yet too many others, myself included, we know it all too well. And let me stress again that this doesn't mean that CYCOM is not worth it. Indeed, some of parents' doubts about vaccinating are genuine and can be allayed by just correcting misinformation. And my colleagues and I have heard from all kinds of people that we have changed their minds about giving their child one or more vaccines. But the issue is that CYCOM has been given an unfair burden that it can't carry on its own. So the body of the Hydra, not only when it comes to vaccines, but other issues of science and society, consist of three main parts. One is the innate desire of individuals to control their own fates. The second is deep and justified anxieties for which proxies take blame. And I'll get into that in a moment. And the false anti-science versus pro-science dichotomy. Both sides typically represent the more extreme views, but they're also the most visible. And then there is the underbelly, where the most marginalized are overlooked as they face the brunt of injustice. And this includes the injustices that fester in the absence of science-based thinking, as well as the injustices perpetrated by the forces of science itself. So as I wrote with my fellow Sci-Moms, the anti-vaccine movement isn't about evidence, it's about who to trust. So the vaccine debate has been raging for 2 centuries, but vaccines have become a stand-in for a number of very real concerns. Who controls our healthcare system? Can we trust the government to ensure that our medications are safe? Who looks out for the marginalized? We're seeing lower vaccination rates and an increase in vaccine preventable illnesses, not because so-called anti-science thinking is on the rise, but because we as a society are struggling for answers to these much deeper questions. And the distrust varies, and it's often fueled again by misinformation. And proxies in this case, like chemicals and conspiracy theories, take the blame for very justified concerns. Now, the food industry can offer some insight into vaccine hesitancy. When it comes to vaccines, what people are worried about, the proxies, versus the real injustices that those proxies represent, again, are toxins, Bill Gates trying to implant microchips into us, and other big pharma conspiracy theories. And you see on the right, the Clean Label Manifesto, the root cause of the clean consumer movement explained. So at the top, I'll give Luna a moment. She wants you to know she's there. But at the top, the visible part of the iceberg, you'll see what consumers say. So it's no to artificial colors and things that you can't pronounce. And yes to mission-driven brands with authentic stories who care about sustainability and the environment and ethics, and the demand for transparency. But underneath all of that is a craving for authenticity and truth, a distrust of industry and government, and a want to be heard and empowered. Now, what's especially interesting and relevant here is also that this Clean Label Manifesto iceberg graphic is from the Clean Label Project. I actually found this when I was doing some research on a talk about the clean food movement. So they're a third-party certifying agency that certifies restaurants like Panera Bread and others as so-called clean, as well as supermarket food products, personal care and baby products, and more. Now, Clean Label Project understands this landscape well, and it knows how to tap into it. It's really no different with the cast of characters that drive anti-vaccine misinformation. So allow me to tell a story. A recent example of this unfolded before my eyes when I attended a local public health meeting in my city of Madison, Wisconsin. The committee took public comment on a proposed position statement to eliminate personal and religious vaccine exemptions for public school attendance. It was a record-setting attendance for this type of public hearing. There were a few people there to give testimony on why they support eliminating these exemptions. A couple of them were physicians just reading off data from study after study, showing the harms of not vaccinating. But most of the people who were there to object, and a few of them stood out to me. One was a tall, charismatic, well-dressed chiropractor with like this dazzling smile and what he called a pharma-free practice. He explained that he proudly treats children and markets himself as a more personable, less establishmentarian replacement for the traditional primary care physician. And he raised some of the usual objections. Another person who was there to oppose eliminating exemptions was a self-proclaimed proud stay-at-home mom. Now, I of course can't generalize, but she presented as a white woman with a comfortable life, and she expressed genuine anger at the medical establishment for taking away her autonomy as her children's mother. And another person who was there was a Black mother with similar sentiments. But she voiced her worry over the historic exploitation of the Black community by the medical establishment, including the horrors of the Tuskegee experiments and the unauthorized widespread sterilization of Black women not long ago. And another Black mother seemed deeply distressed. She too insisted that she will not allow what she saw as a further erosion of her rights as a woman and as a mother to stand. So what do these people have in common, and what brought them to the same public health meeting? Well, chiropractors are a whole other story, and I've covered them enough to understand quite well that chiropractors who eschew the science on a number of the ailments that they purport to treat are sort of a shiny, at times sleazy outward symptom of deep-seated distrust of mainstream medicine. And parents in the audience, anyone with a maternal relationship with someone else, we know how fierce our instinct to protect is. And whether or not I agreed with them, I felt that and identified with it strongly coming from these people. Now, you'll recall that among what CYCOM is equipped to do, there's arming people with a misinformation radar, that is arming people with the tools to unravel information and separate the credible nuggets from the crap. And this includes explaining the types of health science related studies and how to interpret them. For instance, observational data come from studies in which researchers observe what people do in the real world and measure the outcome, whereas a randomized controlled trial assigns one group to receive an intervention while another receives a placebo. And all studies deal with limitations, but when you understand what the common limitations are, you have now a tool with which to assess bad coverage of new studies. Now, I can't get into all of the tools that make up a solid misinformation radar in such a short time, but one of the big ones is risk perception. So I'll touch on that. When we understand what risk really is, we begin to understand how to unravel propaganda that blows risks of various exposures totally out of proportion. So risk perception is at the heart of decision making. It's nearly always irrational. We're hardwired to take shortcuts that we're not consciously aware of, including trust and perceived control. And of course, our emotions play into this. Uncertainty makes everything seem more dangerous. There are ways to teach people to assess risk in more evidence-based ways, but none of us can evaluate the evidence on everything, and none of us is immune to irrational risk perception. So if you think you are, you should probably check yourself. Zero risk basically is an impossible dream. There's a great series over at SciMoms on putting risk in perspective, so I encourage people to check it out. It's really no different with those who worry about vaccines. So this image isn't to scale, but it illustrates the big picture when it comes to health hazards and the magnitude of risk. Risk is a population-based measure, so what's an individual to do? We as the SciMoms think it makes sense to try and control the modifiable risk factors, especially the ones that have a big impact, like the ones pictured here. So you see a few bigger modifiable risk factors like smoking, sedentary lifestyle, air pollution, and not eating fruits and veggies. And then some of the others like red meat, flame retardants, paints, and pesticides. But there are so many more than those pictured here. Think everything from the safety of drinking water to the extreme stress that comes with just living with marginalization. And all of these risk factors absolutely do impact someone's likelihood of all kinds of outcomes, from cancers to heart disease, to chronic health problems and the severity of infectious diseases even. So those of us with the most privilege have far more control over whether or not we can modify these risk factors. But there are still so many unknowns, and the less control that someone feels that they have, whether that's real or perceived lack of control, the more uncertainty that there is. And the leaders of the anti-vaccine movement offer the illusion of control, especially when healthcare doesn't have the answers. So when you feel like there's something you can control, like whether or not your child is vaccinated, it's human nature to latch onto it. Now, I also mentioned the pro-vax and anti-vax extremes. On the left, you see a quote from a popular YouTuber who I won't name, talking about the awful pseudo-documentary that is Plandemic. And this YouTuber writes, "I am shook that Americans are so freaking stupid as to take even a second of this horrible garbage conspiracy nonsense seriously. What's wrong with us as a people? What's gone wrong with our education? What's gone wrong with our common sense?" The first 5 seconds of that video reeks of crazy sauce, and no one can recognize that. I mean, I could feel the contempt dripping from this, and I won't get into the details of Plandemic, but suffice it to say that while it's completely misleading, it relies on all of the usual tactics of persuasion to scare people about vaccines and to make conspiracy theories sound extremely convincing. It's just not stupid or crazy to fall for something like this. But it was heartening to see others in the pro-vaccine camp call out this guy for being awful. And on the right, you see RFK Jr., just another day in his life of exploiting the anxiety of Black people to kind of stir up anti-vaccine feelings. But these extremes don't represent the concerns of ordinary people from all walks of life. And I hope it doesn't represent the views of doctors who encounter parents with genuine concerns. Now, finally, there's the underbelly that I mentioned, where the most marginalized are overlooked as they face the brunt of injustice, including injustices that fester where misinformation thrives, as well as the injustices perpetrated by the forces of science itself. So injustices that happen where misinformation thrives include the fact that low vaccination rates impact the most vulnerable in our communities. For one, the impact of catching a vaccine-preventable disease will be worse for someone who already deals with the lack of access to nutritious foods, lack of access to healthcare, and higher stress levels, let alone a lack of job security, And as we wrote at SciMoms, the consequence of the anti-vaccine movement is that valuable resources continue to be spent readdressing the autism myth when they could be much better spent understanding autism and building spaces and communities where autistic people are accepted. The vaccine autism myth leads to the false and harmful notion that autistic children are damaged or that they could have been cured. And the same anti-vaccine individuals who promote the idea that vaccine injuries can be detoxed and purged also promote harmful autism remedies. And these are just a couple of examples. But the injustices perpetrated by science and the medical establishment themselves are well documented and still have a major impact. Medical misogyny is real, all the way from the research bench to clinicians not taking women seriously. Medical gaslighting is real. That's clinicians suggesting that your symptoms and your feelings and sensations are all in your head. And racism in America is so entrenched that finally, cities and counties are starting to declare racism a public health emergency after centuries of systemic racism constituting what many would call its own pandemic. And while Bill Gates probably isn't trying to implant us with microchips, the focus on conspiracy theories detracts from pertinent, valid analyses of the problem with entrusting global public health to billionaires and the power dynamics inherent in that. And sure, we can separate the causes of these injustices broadly into two columns like I have here, injustices that come from misinformation and the ones perpetrated by the forces of science. But ultimately, in my view, all of these injustices are worthy foes to be vanquished. Now, effective, tenacious CYCOM is going to keep doing effective, tenacious CYCOM. As we wrote in SciMoms, we could write endless screeds about the overwhelming scientific consensus on vaccines. And that the most compelling reason to vaccinate is not to protect your healthy, thriving kid, actually, but to protect the most vulnerable populations, because low vaccination rates hit vulnerable groups the hardest, and so on and so forth. And folks who do CYCOM know well that their work is crucial in staving off the misinformation that causes real harm. But again, the onus cannot be on science communication to move a needle that has hovered more or less where it is today for hundreds of years. That's just not a fair burden. So unless governments and industry and science commit to real justice for all, CYCOM will be doomed to forever slay the heads of the vaccine misinformation hydra. And that would be a tragedy. And it has been a tragedy. People have died and are dying because of it. Now, it might seem like I'm leaving you on a negative, hopeless note, but there is hope. There's hope in knowing what we're up against. There's hope in activism that leads to real social change. And there's hope in knowing that in the end, really, love and humanity is what we all share. And personally, I, as a millennial, have hope in today's secular students. So with that, I will wrap up and take questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Kavin. That was really amazing. In fact, I know I'm going to need to go back and listen to it again. There was just so much there, and not in my normal, as I was saying to you before we started, not in my normal, I guess, reading and research mode. So really, really good to have folks like you out there doing this and slaying these heads. And I guess you can win the game of whack-a-mole, right? Like if you're quick enough and if you have enough.
Or if you unplug the machine. You
could unplug the machine. It's interesting.
That's what dealing with injustice is like. It's like unplugging the machine.
And it's a challenge that we're facing in liberal democracy right now, that how not to be authoritarian while trying to protect as many people as we can. And there is a tension there. I really appreciate you sort of lifting up that tension, you know, that it's not a simple thing necessarily. We want to limit as much as possible authorities mandating things, you know. We don't, you know, we like it when authorities mandate things that we think are good. And there are some benign things like don't use plastic grocery bags, like nobody's gonna suffer and the planet will benefit.
There's always the risk of not using plastic grocery bags, as we have now seen during a pandemic.
That's right, exactly, yeah. Yeah, we actually legalized them for a little while in re-legalized them in California. Now it's again illegal, so back and forth. But in California, where I live, we did make vaccines mandatory. We did remove those religious exemptions. And I think in your map, I saw that California was white, indicating that it was one of the few states that had no
exemptions. Yeah,
yeah,
right.
no, yeah. So, I mean, I guess you've sort of shared some thoughts on that. I mean, and you said you're kind of on the fence, like, and it's tough, like the pandemic. Are there times where you feel like for the greater good, we have to limit individual choice in that way?
Like you said, I hate to say that we should. I'm sure there are situations in which it would make sense, and it would maybe be our ethical duty as a society to do so. Say if smallpox somehow made a comeback, then maybe. I hesitate to say that I would support doing that, but I probably would, given the right situation.
Yeah, it's a very delicate thing, and not something you want to just have in your arsenal to pull out anytime you have a problem with the government or with public health or anything else. A couple questions from the audience. This comes from Rhett, who I have to say has been a faithful viewer of the SSA virtual conference. Thank you, Rhett, for being here. How do you address comments like, my child was fine before the vaccine, and right after he or she started exhibiting signs of autism? Are these all fake, or was that an example of an accident waiting to happen, that any number of certain medications could have triggered this?
So that's a complex question. If you ask broadly scientists who research autism, they'll say that the causes are broadly genetic, kind of innate causes, as well as some environmental factors. But to the question of parents saying that my child was fine and then started exhibiting these symptoms, you see that a lot, and it's hard. It's really hard because the age around which autism is usually diagnosed, it's like a toddler age. There are a lot of vaccines that are given then. And so certainly I wouldn't tell a parent, like, you're, as that one blogger said, crazy sauce or whatever. But it's tough, and there's a lot of complexity there.
Yeah, and people are putting other people at risk. And I think that's what you ended on that note, I thought, which was really good, which is that it's not just about you and your kids. It's really, and I think the pandemic puts it front and center. We vaccinate children when they're very small, and we're talking now about literally all of us being susceptible to this. And is there something in science denial, or how do you account for this feeling that I have, and maybe there's a technical term for it, where it's hard for me to believe that something's true unless I've experienced it myself? Because I'm seeing this with the pandemic, that people can be pretty denialish about it until their grandmother gets sick and dies, and then they end up sick, and they're like, oh, wait a minute, maybe it's not so bad. How, is it tough? Is it just tough in general for us to believe things that don't affect us?
I'm not really well versed on the literature, the psychology literature, when it comes to believing what doesn't affect us. But yeah, certainly there's evidence that what we've experienced is like our lived experience really influence our worldviews, of course. And I raised this earlier in the talk about how when my daughter was born in 2011, I was terrified. And like the terror was such that it was actually a postpartum mental health condition called postpartum OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. So I was actually terrified of everything. And I'm reading all of this messaging, which of course is at our fingertips. And at the time, I didn't necessarily know how to wade through all of it. So experiencing that level of almost pathological fear, I think, gave me a sort of empathy that, I don't know how other people feel. Like I could only speak to my own experiences. But yeah, I mean, that's a complicated question too. I'm not the best with like direct answers. Like I hope
it's a complicated topic, and I think if you were to give simple yes no answers, that would be wouldn't be real. Here's a question from Facebook that is more on the communication side than the science side. Lorraine asks, how do you choose how to balance who you give time to on your page in terms of science deniers versus who gets ignored or banned? This has to do, I think, with like how do you have these difficult conversations
on social media? Hi, Lorraine. I think you mean about Facebook page or Twitter. There is research on that too, on how people, whether it be someone who runs an author page like I do, or just like I mentioned, the tenacious individuals who are out there, and by out there I mean on social media, just refuting mythology as it pops up. And then there's one wonderful Facebook group full of volunteers, many of whom are parents who look into this research on how to do it effectively. And it's the question of who to give credence or time, or who to engage with. It depends. Like if you come to realize, and I'm sure Lorraine, you know this too, that you can tell the difference between someone who has a good faith question and someone who's trolling. So obviously, I might not engage with someone who is trolling, but there's value to having these conversations where other people see it. Again, the evidence on how exactly this works is it's there, but not totally clear.
Right. Here's a question from our YouTube audience. What can scientists, again, we're expecting you to have like answers to some of these things where we're just asking for your opinion. What can scientists, doctors, health experts, et cetera, do right now to earn some street cred or justice street cred ahead of the release of a hypothetical COVID-19 vaccine?
I hate to come back to this example, but I'm going to. You saw the beloved by some MD and blogger who suggested that people who fall for these things are crazy sauce or stupid, and please don't do that. But the thing is that I jotted this down, but basically, not only was this a YouTube video, but it was on a medical website where that provides accredited continuing medical education credits to clinicians. And honestly, like the first step to take is just like, you can't make a doctor, you can't change a doctor's worldview the same way you can't change someone else's worldview. But there are plenty of doctors who straight up like don't take women seriously, or non-binary people seriously, or people of color seriously. Just listen, take people seriously. But I think doctors can do their part in kind of doing the best for their own cred. But I think it also starts with scientists and biomedical researchers. Really, it comes back to centering social justice. I mean, it really does. Once you center social justice in and healthcare and science, and really, really, really do that work, and not just like pay it lip service, I really believe, and there's evidence to suggest that these other problems should resolve. I mean, be a decent person before you're a doctor.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think the medical profession, I mean, I used to work in a X-ray file room in a hospital, and yeah, met a lot of doctors, and some of them.
I love me a good doctor. I had doctors.
I know, my doctor's great. I found a good one.
Oh yeah, and I'm not to like be negative about doctors, but you know, we're all in that kind of place where we're kind of like, what the hell is going on, and who do we trust? So
yeah, I see it, you know, totally outside of the science community, you know, just thinking of people in a different part of the country from where you live, for example, thinking of like people who vote a certain way as being less intelligent or something like that. And I just don't think, like you said, I agree with you completely, that that's not helpful. It doesn't really get us anywhere in this process. We want to try to win people over by being reasonable, but also by sharing the truth. And not everybody's gonna come around.
Unless it's what someone, an entity, or an individual who I call an SQW or a status quo warrior. Like, I think we should marginalize the heck out of them.
Yeah.
But that's my opinion.
Yeah, people that are making it worse. Well, I want to end our session today with a quick poll. So if everybody that's on Zoom can participate in this poll, and here I go.
I'm gonna tell her.
So please vote whether you love tuna.
She's 14 years old. I've had her since I was, she is 14. I've had her since I was 23. I've had her for 14 years. And her little brother Sebastian is being very, the reason that I put her down in that room is if they were up here, and if anybody walked past with their dog, then they would have barked up here and it would have been worse.
Would have been much worse, yeah.
Yeah, also, I guess you can let me know on Twitter or Facebook how many treats Luna, the best girl ever, deserves.
That's right. Well, we have one outlier. Not everyone loves dogs, but by and large, we all think that Luna.
You would love her if you met her, even if you're not a dog person.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kavin, for spending this time with us and sharing your expertise. And we'll keep track of you. Please follow Kavin on Twitter, Senapathy, at Senapathy, and also at SciMoms. And you can find it just by Googling them if that, if you have any trouble. But thanks again for what you do. And we'll be lifting up your work as we get closer, hopefully, to a coronavirus vaccine, this COVID-19 vaccine. Good luck.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for having me. And I hope you all did a great job. So get some rest.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody who's been here. It's been a good time. This brings our conference to a close. All the videos are on demand on our YouTube, unless the speaker asks specifically for it not to be kept up online. So if you missed some that you want to go back and see, or if you know folks that didn't get to see all of them and wanted to, they're all there. And we'll look forward to hearing your comments, and please stay in touch with us. Support Secular Student Alliance if you're able. Go to secularstudents.org /donate, and know that the donations that you make go to help us support and resource and empower secular students on campuses around the country speak out on the issues that you've been hearing about this week. All right. Thanks, everyone. Good night.